was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 1993. So at first glance, Keynes and Ronald have nothing in common, except they're both great English economists who love the ballet and who attacked Pigou. Pigou was a colleague of Keynes's at Cambridge. In fact, Pigou was the professor of economics, and Keynes was just a fellow. They attacked different parts of Pigou. Keynes attacked Pigou's theory of unemployment, and Ronald attacked his theory of externalities. So this, so far, is not much to build a comparison on. And of course, there are a lot of ways in which they differ. Keynes was a liberal. Coase, of course, is conservative. Keynes was a macroeconomist. Coase is a microeconomist. Keynes was upper class. I mean, nothing, no offense intended. A celebrity, a great public figure, a baron. A man of the world, a speculator, in his youth a homosexual, what we who study such things call an opportunistic homosexual. He was a brilliant writer on diverse subjects, of course. He was a bestseller. He was Eton, Cambridge, the Apostles, Bloomsbury, the establishment, the intellectual and governing elite of England. And Ronald is none of these things, and he's also an expatriate, almost an American, and Keynes didn't much like Americans. But these differences are superficial from the standpoint of their approaches to economics, because they share an approach that was once dominant, that fell into disfavor, but that's undergoing a revival as a result of the worldwide financial crash of September 2008, which took the economics profession by surprise and has created profound doubts about the profession's understanding of the economy. It was shortly after the crash that I read for the first time Keynes's masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936. I found Keynes's approach unfamiliar but convincing, and it did put me in mind of my paper on Ronald's methodology, and I went back and I reread it. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, what I said descriptively about Ronald's methodology in that article, I think is correct, especially since it was mainly just quoting from Ronald. I summarized it by saying that Ronald had declared war on modern economics. And in support of that, I quoted statements such as, when economists find that they are unable to analyze what is happening in the real world, they invent an imaginary world which they are capable of handling. He wrote that the rational model, which is central to modern economics, is, this is all quotations from Ronald's, is unnecessary and misleading because, in his words, there's no reason to suppose that most human beings are engaged in maximizing anything unless it be unhappiness, and even this with incomplete success. He wants economists to study man as he is. He wants to abandon the assumption that an individual's choices are consistent. He does not regard equilibrium, seems not to regard equilibrium as a useful concept in economics. And he's skeptical not only about abstraction and the formalization of economic theory. One of the reasons he doesn't like the term Coase theorem, which belongs to, formal theory. Theorems belong to formal theory, obviously. He's also skeptical about empirical methods, the heavily statistical empirical methods that modern economists employ. He rejects the influential methodological principle of Milton Friedman that a theory should be tested not by the realism of its assumptions, but by the accuracy of its predictions. He prefers the case study to the study of statistical data as a way of doing empirical economics. I said in my article, I think this is correct, that there are two basic conceptions of economics as a field. And the older one conceived of economics as the study of the economic system with whatever tools are at hand. The newer approach to economics conceives of it as the application of the model of rational choice to any domain of human behavior in which the use of the model might be fruitful. It's not limited to the economic system in the conventional sense of trade. Ronald is an adherent to the older conception of economics. And he's gone so far as to say, that is to write, so I'll have them all nailed down in prose, that there's been very little progress in economics since Adam Smith. And in fact, there may have been regress. There are two further small points that bear on the relation between Ronald and Keynes. One is that when Ronald, in his Nobel Prize talk, said that his work will one day, he thought his work will one day bring about a complete change in the structure of economic theory, he added, at least in what is called price theory or microeconomics. But in fact, the utility of the approach that he shares with Keynes, I think, is even greater in macroeconomics than in micro. A second little curiosity is that Ronald has claimed to not to have been significantly influenced by any American economist other than Frank Knight. And Knight is the economist who agreed with Keynes on a critical point in the general theory, which I'm going to mention. So the general theory, the masterpiece. In 1992, Greg Mankiw, who then as now is a prominent macroeconomist at Harvard, wrote that, quote, after 50 years of additional progress in economic science, the general theory is an outdated book. We are in a much better position than Keynes was to figure out how the economy works. And in a moment, you'll see Greg Mankiw eating those words. So the general theory is not outdated. What is true, it's a hard read. Not because it's mathematical. It's not a mathematical book. There's some math, not a great deal. It's what there is high school algebra and a little bit of differential calculus. And although Keynes had started as a mathematician, written a book on probability theory, he's kind of apologetic about the math and the general theory, and he actually at one point says, you can skip it. Instead of being a mathematical work, it's a work of really elegant prose. I think that's somewhat off-putting to economists who are not, that interested in literary values generally. It's full of aphorisms, like, it is better that a man should tyrannize over his bank balance than over his fellow citizens. So it's full of that kind of thing. It's also full of unfamiliar terms and digressions and afterthoughts and some really stray observations, such as, I'm quoting, the two most delightful occupations open to those who do not have to earn their living are authorship and experimental farming. Well, that's not the sort of thing you're going to read in Econometrica. In fact, general theory is especially difficult reading for present-day academic economists because their conception of economics is so remote from Keynes's. That's what made the book seem outdated to Mankiw, and it led Bob Lucas, writing a few years after Mankiw, to characterize the general theory as an ideological event rather than a contribution to economic theory. And before that, in 1980, Bob Lucas had notoriously written that when Keynesian economics is mentioned in an economics workshop, the people attending the workshop whisper and giggle. I don't think he'd say that today. So as I say, Keynes, like Coase, adhered to this older view that economics is the study of the economic system, and you use whatever analytical or empirical methods you think apt to the particular subject you're looking at. There was a presumption, and I think this is true of Ronald's work, despite that crack about people trying to maximize unhappiness. There was a presumption, his work and Keynes's work, in this whole older field of economics, that business firms do try to maximize profits, individuals do try to maximize their utility, But how well they succeeded was left open. So Keynes wanted to be realistic about decision-making rather than explore how far an economist can get by assuming that people base decisions on a close approximation to cost-benefit analysis. And that's a perfectly good approach for economists to take. My point is only that it's not the only approach, and that we should have renewed appreciation for the approach that Keynes takes, and that I think Ronald shares. So you find in the general theory a number of psychological observations. In fact, the word psychological appears many times in the general theory, and it's said without apology. Keynes doesn't say, I'm an economist, but I've got the psychological point I really think I have to make. I'm sorry, but no, he's very unself-conscious about what tools, what assumptions, what concepts he uses. And in fact, psychology is very important to his analysis. He says some things like, which is echoed today, he says, during a boom, the popular estimation of risk is apt to become unusually and imprudently low, which is what many people are saying today about the boom that preceded our current bust. And he says, which is also extremely pertinent, that during a bust, the, quote, animal spirits, it's a big phrase in the general, it only appears once in the general theory, but it's been picked up a lot. He says the animal spirits of entrepreneurs droop. So he uses these insights without worrying about how they fit into a model of rational decision-making. Now, this approach came very naturally to Keynes because he wasn't an academic economist in the modern sense of the word. He didn't have a degree in economics. He wrote extensively in other fields. I mentioned that he started out as a mathematician. He wrote a book on probability theory that doesn't mention economics at all. He was an economics fellow at Cambridge, but he combined that with extensive government service, civil service, he's an important civil servant, high-level government advisor, speculator, polemicist, a journalist, extremely eclectic and extremely involved in the economic, financial, and political life of England. And another striking feature of the general theory, it's not empirical, it's not theoretical in a kind of formal mathematical sense, it's also not empirical. There are few tables of statistics, but there's no analytic statistics in the book. Now, of course, Keynes, unlike Ronald, didn't do case studies, but he didn't have to do case studies. He was sort of a case study of himself because he was involved in government, was involved in business, systematize. Now, but there is now, I think, an important difference. Ronald, I think, could have, if he'd wanted to, he could have written his papers in the idiom of modern economics, because his despite what Harold said this morning, the basic approach is classical economics, and certain parts of it are not congenial to Ronald, but it's recognizably classical economic analysis, but. Concepts that are central to the general theory don't, I think, fit formal models in economics very well. Of course, you're dealing with, in macroeconomics, business cycle economics, so on, you're dealing with vast economy-wide phenomena and the interrelations of money and interest rates and employment and all sorts of things. It's actually it seems to be too complicated to model. And it seems to be one of the reasons that the macroeconomists and the finance theorists were, with only a few exceptions, failed to anticipate the financial crisis of 2008 and the ensuing, deep downturn in the economy. And in the wake of this real disappointment for the economics profession, we have Greg Mankiw now writing contritely, if you were going to turn to only one economist to understand the problems facing the economy, there's little doubt that the economist would be John Maynard Keynes. Although Keynes died more than a half-century ago, his diagnosis of recessions and depressions remains the foundation of modern macroeconomics. His insights go a long way toward explaining the challenges we now confront. That's a kind of remarkable statement, and Greg Mankiw, by the way, is a conservative macroeconomist. He's not a lefty. But it turns out that Keynes's informal, unrigorous, unmathematized analysis of the macroeconomy seems to have provided greater insight into our current economic situation than 75 years of increasingly formal, rigorous, mathematized analysis. I mean, when you have the leading economic student of the Great Depression, that's Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, blindsided by a repetition of the circumstances that led to the Great Depression, credit binge over leveraged banks, new era thinking, and who then responds with a sort of conventional monetary policy response that doesn't, just reducing the federal funds rate, and it doesn't work, then you begin to suspect that the disappointing performance of the economics profession in regard to the current crisis is due to forgetfulness of Keynes. I wanted to say something about this link between Knight and Keynes, because I think it's very important to understanding the Keynesian methodology. So you have to start off with, I'll call this the separation thesis. So something very much emphasized in Keynes is the distinction between the people who save money and by saving provide money for investment in projects, and the people who do the projects, the entrepreneurs, the firms. They're different people. And you can have a situation which people decide to save, and they hoard. They're afraid to spend money. So they're just saving, they're sitting on it. And this could limiting investment funds. And then on the other side, you have a situation where, well, maybe the savers would like to invest and so on, but the people actually have to decide on a project. Are they going to build a factory which isn't going to yield any revenue for 2 or 3 years? Should they do that? What Keynes said, using the concept of uncertainty that he and Knight had independently discovered, he said there's a big difference between two types of risk. One is a calculable risk, and he illustrated with roulette. If you're not worried about the casino cheating, you know exactly what the probability is of hitting red if you're betting on red on a roulette wheel. But the question you ask yourself is, how likely is it that you're going to be divorced when you get married? You decide whether to get married, you say, well, what's the probability of my being divorced? You can't figure that out. There are divorce statistics, but you can't apply them on the individual level. So that's uncertainty. So the puzzle for Keynes was, what is it that makes people engage in uncertain behavior, and in particular in the case of businessmen? Because very often, the decision the businessman has to make, whether to invest, have a project, new design, buy a firm, expand, subtract, what have you, expand, contract, it's a decision made under profound uncertainty. You can try to hedge, insure to a certain extent, but not completely. And so the other question arises, well, is it rational for a person to make an investment when his estimate of the expected net benefits is little more than a guess, because he can't assign a probability to the success of the enterprise, may be uncertain about costs and all sorts of things. And I think this is a question that is uncomfortable for modern economists, because how do you do cost-benefit analysis if you don't know the probability of the benefits and the costs? And so Keynes's response to this is not to worry about what's rational and what's irrational, because I say his analysis doesn't depend on any very definite assumptions about human behavior. He simply had observed businessmen taking non-calculable risks. And he observed if there weren't any people willing to do that, people who had what he called an urge to action, a capitalist economy simply wouldn't function. So business is a field of activity. It attracts bold people, The timid people, they become civil servants or professors, and the bold engage in the entrepreneur. And they're people who just have greater tolerance for uncertainty, less uncertainty aversion. So the next point is that this emotion, these animal spirits, the boldness that will cause business people to make investments under uncertainty, this is a kind of a fragile psychological asset you have, this willingness to take risks, your animal spirits, and they can dim very suddenly in a situation of economic distress. I mean, you can take only so much uncertainty. So, and that's how you get into a bust situation, a depression, a serious recession. So what happened in our current situation was that there's a tremendous drop in household wealth because of the bursting of the housing bubble. So when people's wealth declines, they change their behavior. They save more. They change their pattern of consumption expenditures. And now, at the other side, the businessmen, seeing this change in consumer behavior and uncertainties mounting up as they wonder about how government is going to respond and so on, they begin to freeze. Their animal spirits dim. And you result, of course, you can get yourself into a downward cycle. People save money, maybe they spend less or spend on different things. Producers produce less, so they employ less. Now people have lower incomes and greater anxieties, and that affects their consumption. You get yourself into a downward spiral. Now, this is simply an example of how, in certain situations where the formalisms of modern economics just have great difficulty dealing with issues because they just don't fit the type of formal thinking that economists do. Here's an example of an informal type of economics done by Keynes can yield these very important insights. And this, I think, is also characteristic of Ronald's economics. But now I have a question for Ronald. So Keynes, of course, was a liberal, a lefty by our standards today, and that liberalism was perfectly in tune with his approach to economics. He didn't consider markets to be regulating. He thought, this is not something I mentioned, but this is actually a big emphasis in the general theory. He actually thought involuntary unemployment could be an equilibrium, to be stuck there. He thought, he advocated extensive government intervention to keep the economy from running off the rails. There's actually a utopian streak in the general theory, I'm sure quite repulsive to everybody in this room, because he predicted that within a century, people's material wants would be satiated. And when that happened, the demand for capital would plummet. And rentier, people who just live on investment income, they would be wiped out, which he wanted. That prospect delighted Keynes, and he looked forward to, in his words, the euthanasia of the rentier. He didn't mean it literally. But as I say, his economics and his politics were in phase. But now, Ronald's extreme hostility to government regulation, of which we've heard a lot today and yesterday, I don't think it sorts so well with his skepticism about rational choice economics. There's a passage in The Problem of Social Cost where he suggests that sort of all pollution is due to the government. But think about it. If he's right and people are busy maximizing their unhappiness and markets are never in equilibrium, you'd think that would mean there was a lot of work left for the government to do. Not that it would do it well, but if you have these profound market failures, you would at least want to explore with some care the potentiality for the government. In particular, given his theory of social cost, in which transaction costs can prevent contractual solutions to externalities, you'd think there'd be some sympathy for government regulation of pollution. And also, Ronald's hostility to government regulation, it doesn't seem to have the analytical basis or theoretical basis that you can find in Hayek and other members of the Austrian School of Economics, or you can find in Mansur Olson or George Stigler or the other, public choice people. It seems Ronald's hostility to government to be entirely empirical. He studied the British Post Office and the Federal Communications Commission, the private ownership of lighthouses. And in all these and other economic settings that he's studied, he's found either that regulation does badly, or that, as in the lighthouse example, the private market does well despite circumstances that theory suggests should prevent the market from working. But presumably, he picks his case studies with an eye to probable government failure and surprise successes of the private market where you might expect a government failure. He doesn't seem to be interested in studying the government successes, of which there must be some, since we're still, surviving under our government. So the firmness of his conclusions about government failure doesn't appear to be based on a theory of government, but instead appears to reflect the confidence with which he rejects formal theory and formal empirical methods in favor of his adherence to a tradition, which I consider an illustrious tradition, and we could call it common sense economics, and I think it's the economics of Adam Smith, of John Maynard Keynes, and of Ronald Coase. They're all economic geniuses, and our current economic troubles have invited renewed respect.
Your paper talks about the macadamization of economics, and one sort of sees in there perhaps some agreement with the notion that the common sense approach may be superior in some ways, at least in terms of utility. And what I was wondering about is, when we think about law and economics and where law and economics is going, we have seen as more lawyers are formally trained with PhDs, we have seen a growing technical nature of the work, as well as we're now seeing a boom of econometric work being done in law and economics. And my question is, how do you evaluate that in terms of its utility in terms of legal change, in terms of legal thinking about law? And is it something that is supplanting the former common sense approach in terms of standards in universities? And do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? And if it's a bad thing, is there any way of turning back on that?
No, I think that's fine, and I think statistical analysis is tremendously valuable. And so, an example this morning was Bill Landis's talk about citations, but an example from this morning was Michael Levine's paper about the airline industry, because obviously Michael Levine is bringing something different to the table, which is his immersion in the airline industry, not just as a scholar, but of course as an official of 3 airlines, spent a number of years in the airline industry. And I think that's extremely valuable, and that we don't want to lose sight of alternatives to the mathematical approach. So Bob Lucas, who I like beating up on occasionally, he's written that the only thing that's happened since Adam Smith is a greater formalization of economics, that progress in economics means progress in mathematical modeling, and of progress in economic theory means progress in mathematization. I think that's an exaggeration. And I think what we found with regard to business cycle economics is that the mathematization has not been useful because the business cycle is too complicated to be modeled. And we've also found that one of the reasons that the economics profession was so surprised by what happened in 2008 is that very few macroeconomists have any real institutional knowledge. They didn't know a lot about modern banking and its fragilities, and because it's very complicated, you have to really immerse yourself in detail. And those institutional details are very difficult, if at all, maybe impossible, to accommodate in a formal theory. And particularly for economics in a law school, considering who the students are and the background of the law professors, that ought to be not just, the economists in a law school should not just constitute an economics department that happens to find itself in a law school and studies economic problems that relate to law. It ought also to be something distinctive which brings in knowledge and reasoning methods and of law, so that you have something besides conventional, modern, formal economics being sort of accidentally conducted in a law school.
I have a couple of points to make. I don't really see the connection between Coase and Keynes, to tell you the truth. If you look at the three most widely cited articles of Coase, and I'm taking this from Bill Landis, something like 80 to 90% of his citations, they're not on, mainly, they don't refer to the points that you mentioned in your talk. There are three papers: The Theory of the Firm, Problem of Social Costs, and The Durable Goods Problem. Now, in all three of these papers, he basically uses neoclassical type reasoning. In fact, the durable goods problem is a very sophisticated example of that reasoning, and therefore has mainly attracted the attention of theorists, game theorists, and other theorists. Those have been the main people who have been interested in it, but it's been very highly cited. It's a very insightful paper on what happens to competition over time. The Theory of the Firm says, look, it's more efficient to have things within a firm than outside the firm. You're doing it within the firm. I mean, it maybe doesn't write an equation down. The theory of social costs says, well, look, you have this reciprocal thing. You try to bargain to an efficient solution. If you can't, you try to work out some as best you can. And I don't see that outside the neoclassical tradition. I've always thought it's a false dichotomy between mathematical formulations and non-mathematical formulations. I had a teacher, I'm sure Ronald respects a lot, Jacob Viner. Now, Jacob Viner hardly ever used any mathematics. He was very ill-trained in mathematics. In fact, one of his most famous mistakes was because he didn't really understand what's called the envelope theorem. But Jacob Viner was a very outstanding neoclassical economist and made important contributions to neoclassical economists. I think that's where Ronald's contributions have lied, beside the obiter dicta he may have said about people are irrational and so on. He was using rational economists. Now, if you look at Keynes, Keynes is a very mixed picture. In much of his life, he was actually a liberal in the European sense, not an interventionist. He became an interventionist more during the Great Depression. His tract on monetary reform is a great use of economics, traditional economics, but really very insightful. And I'm not a macroeconomist, but macroeconomists began to discard their confidence in Keynes really after two events. One, Keynesian at the time predicted a Great Depression after World War II. Larry Klein and other leading Keynesians. It didn't happen. Yet the simple Keynesian model that they were all using at the time predicted that savings would grow as a fraction of income, where you wouldn't be able to get the investment to finance it, and you'd go wrong. Secondly, they predicted this great trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and a lot of work said, at least at that time, that wasn't happening. You were getting inflation and high unemployment at the same time. So people abandoned it, or maybe they abandoned it prematurely. But it wasn't only the mathematical economists who abandoned it. Many economists either abandoned the simple Keynesian model or try to merge the sort of rational expectations literature with some Keynesian, I think, real insights into sticky wages and issues of that type that had always been recognized in the economics literature but never really well treated. Now, maybe that literature is better than the dynamic, general equilibrium literature that is associated with Bob, and maybe not. But let me add that I think financial crisis that we got into, you find more insights into Milton Friedman's work on monetary history and the role of monetary mischief than you find in Keynes.
Well, if I could just respond briefly, that business of that Phillips curve stuff is not in Keynes. It's what Keynes says, and the general theory is, if you have full employment and you try to increase demand, you just get inflation. Beginning very shortly after Keynes, with Hicks, Keynesian economics became something very different from what is in the general theory. And of course, Keynes was dying in 1946, was not around to express a view on that. And just one thing, no, I agree with you about Ronald's work is basically classical economics. Now, but you wouldn't want a situation in which you said, well, Ronald, because you haven't written this in mathematical form, we're not going to give you tenure.
What I see is surprisingly close parallels between Coase and time. If you read the first part of The Nature of the Curve, where Mr. Coase explains how the market really works, and then you read knowledge or the use of knowledge society, those standards are surprisingly similar, and the approaches are surprisingly similar. Of course, world economists are doing different stuff, but I really see big parallels between Coase and time, and moreover, if there is an economist that you should learn from about the financial requirements of the day, it's not Keynes, but it's Time.
Yeah, I have trouble with this public address system.
Yeah, it's very hard. Well, I think I heard what he was saying, so maybe I'll start out. Well, Hayek was a great economist. No, I'm not going to try to argue against it. He was my teacher when he was at the University of Chicago, when he was in the Committee on Social Thought. I don't really see the connection with Coase, to tell you the truth. And I've always found Hayek's Prices and Production, which is his most famous book on business cycles, unreadable. Maybe it's my own limitations, but I tried it 5 times, and I couldn't really figure out what he was saying, but maybe it was a great book. He did do great work, but his great work came later, in my judgment, in his analysis of the role of prices and the information communicated by prices. There you might find some connection with Coase, but he did not himself or many of his followers believe that you had to have a detailed institutional knowledge of the economy, study individual industries, and so on. He never did it himself, to my knowledge, and he never advocated it, and never has his followers advocated it. And this is what Ronald has advocated. Maybe it hasn't, it has been followed to some extent by economists in the profession. You need, like I thought, the paper today by Levine on the airline industry. To me, he used neoclassical economics, but neoclassical economics embedded in a very close knowledge of how that industry operated. And when I spoke to him in private afterwards about why did the unions allow it, he had good answers combining law and economic reasoning to explain why the unions, and that was an important part of his stories, evolved. But if you look at the main emphasis in Coase, I don't really see the connection with Hayek, except possibly his American Economic Review article on the role of prices in conveying information and why central planning can't do it, although that's not an issue that Coase really ever addressed to my knowledge.
Richard?
This is to bring Jeff back into the equation.
I'm perfectly happy to listen.
Same question. When you make a distinction between the First Amendment and the property rights issue, is you assume that one is basically a private law problem, the other has systematic values with respect to the public side. One of the things about Ronald is it's hinted at in the FCC article, not fully explicit, is that it's not hinted at. The complete breakdown of the public allocation system with respect to frequencies under the public interest convenience and necessity standard. And the connection is if you start having that set of indefinite property rights, you corrode democratic institutions by inducing faction, rent-seeking, all sorts of public choice, and so forth. And so, therefore, when you play these kinds of games, the economic system is every bit as important for the stability of democracy, because if you don't have definite property rights, what you do is you undermine it. And one of the things that ties in with the other stuff is there isn't much public choice in Keynes or any discussion. But I think, in fact, Ronald, compared to, say, Jim Buchanan, explains why it is that your effort to distance the one from the other is ultimately a failure. But I'm just curious whether or not you agree with that assessment.
Well, it depends in part on whether you're asking the question about what our Constitution means, or what Constitution you want to write.
Private property shall not be taken without justice.
Well, okay, but that, we've been around that.
No, but I mean, if you listen to the discussion this morning, you were talking about the right to disposition as being an essential part of property. Disposition is what sets up voluntary transactions. Protect the property, protect the voluntary transactions, because the whole genius of the system of private property is within its own domain. It gives you a complete definition and allocation of all resources associated with things. So I mean, I think it's really very intimate between them.
I think the theory is substantively interesting and useful, but attributing it to the Constitution, I think, is erroneous. I mean, I don't think in adopting the Taken Clause the framers had Epstein in mind. And I don't think they had it even remotely in mind. And they may also not have had in mind New Dancing. But the leap is a lot less than it is with respect to what they had in mind and the kind of economic system that you would like to put in place.
Privileges and immunities, classic illustration of a preference for competition over monopoly. And that, I think, is a lot of what Ronald was about, and what the objections to the bad reading of the Takings Clause that you contend is about. We've letting monopolistic institutions take over politically, and I think that was a serious fear if you just associated with faction, which is obviously a very dominant concern of the time.
Yes.
I'd like the panel to see if you can apply the Coase theorem to the financial crisis, which I think has been raised by Judge Posner. And that is the basic thesis of Coase, as I understand it, is that private costs and social costs are going to be equalized unless you have a defective institutional framework. Now, isn't that exactly what happened in the financial crisis? In other words, I mean, Judge Posner, you made the claim that you hear a lot in the media that this was market failure. And in fact, the title of your book, A Failure of Capitalism. And then at the end of your book, of course, you completely reverse yourself and you talk about government failure at the end of your book. And lots of studies have come out now, the Wall Street Journal, I mean, book after book, to show that there was a defective institutional problem in the United States in housing, how we excessively encourage this real estate boom and so forth. So, given all those studies that have come out, how can you still say this was a market failure of capitalism, a failure of capitalism?
I'm sure he would. So let me explain the title. So capitalism is a system. It's not synonymous with free markets. And we've heard a lot about it. You need property rights. No, wait a second. Let me finish. So capitalism is a system, and its parts include not only the markets, but include a government that enforces property rights and contracts and so on, and it includes a central bank. Now, some people think you don't need a central bank, you have free banking, but most economists believe that for modern economy, it needs a central bank. What I argue in the book is that the main cause of the problem was incompetent regulation by the Federal Reserve, both regulation of the money supply, interest rates, and regulation of banking. So that's what I think basic. Where there is an externality and therefore a market failure has to do with the fact that if you're in finance, you will be concerned about, and you're a bank, you're deciding how much risk to take. You will be concerned about the cost to you of bankruptcy. But you will not be concerned about the cost to the entire economy if you and the rest of the banks, because you have common strategies, are all subject to the same risk, and the risk happens to materialize, and there's a crash. And when you have an externality, there is at least a prima facie case for government intervention. And that's why we have bank regulation. It's why we have a central bank. And it seems to me those institutions of capitalism, which are fundamental and very important, that's what failed. I don't blame the bankers at all. It seems to me the bankers took risks which they thought were reasonable given what they knew, but they were not going to be super cautious because of possible macroeconomic risk, or systemic risk as it's called, because you don't expect a profit-maximizing firm to worry about costs that its conduct will impose on strangers to the firm. So I doubt that there's any disagreement between us.
Well, no, I would disagree. I think the way you describe it, Dick, it's the failure of government. I mean, treating the Fed as an instrument of the government, which it basically is. I would not write a book called The Failure or A Failure of Capitalism, but I do believe that many of the private sector markets performed poorly during this episode. I don't think they, for whatever reason, in terms of, and I went down, as I was talking to somebody at lunch, I think the consumers in some ways behaved a lot better than the lenders did. I mean, you got very low interest rates, almost no down payments. Of course it pays to buy a house, so they take away from you in 2 years. You owned a house for 2 years with pretty low cost. Why people carried these assets is the problem. We have to understand better why they had such high multiples on their asset to capital ratios. And I think in retrospect they made mistakes. I mean, they didn't maybe fully understand the systemic risk. And it's true, the Fed made mistakes. Both Greenspan and Bernanke, they made mistakes, but I think the private sector made important mistakes as well. So I would say but in evaluating capitalism, the reason I wouldn't, various markets failed in this case. I do believe they did. But I'd like to evaluate the system not over a 2-year period where the economy was flat or declined for a couple of quarters. Now it seems to be increasing, but over a 20-year period where the growth rate was very high, unemployment was very low, inflation was low, and a lot of good things happened in both the U.S. and the world economy. This, to me, was a great success of markets. And in the fall of 2008, there was a fear that because it looked like we're going to be in for a really severe crash, that we're going to overthrow, as the 30s did, overthrow a lot of the attributes of capitalism. At the time, I argued I didn't think it would happen if we didn't get into anywhere near a Great Depression. It didn't happen. I don't think it is going to happen. You're going to get modification in markets, but you're not going to get an overthrow. Why? I think for a simple reason that most of the world still recognizes that a capitalist, what I would call a capitalist system, a market system, has provided great benefits for its population. So you don't see China, you don't see India, you don't see Brazil.
What I think what I think Gary is leaving out, I think the political consequences of this crash are tremendous. That the government is far more deeply involved in business than it has been since the 30s, and there's no sign of that changing. I mean, you've got major corporations that are government-owned now. Citigroup basically is owned by the government. General Motors is owned by the government. The government is far more deeply involved now in the housing industry than it was during the boom. These are tremendous consequences, plus the enormous deficits. We're going to have $1 trillion a year deficits, at least for several years, on top of a very large public debt. I think when you put the political consequences and the fiscal consequences together, you're dealing with something that's really big. I mean, not as big as the Great Depression, but really big compared to anything we've had since the 30s.
Okay, our boss Richard is telling us that we must end this despite it being incredibly
We must end conditional upon one thing. I started with thanks to Marjorie Holm of this law school and Sarah O of George Mason Law School. All of you have benefited from their administrations, understand just how important their contribution has been. So I'd like to thank them. I would also like to thank all the participants and all of the panels for what I thought was really a wonderful and stimulating session. And I'm glad we ended on such a happy note with respect to the future of America. But at least those of you who need to make your planes, please be on your way. And I know you're a regional airline expert who could get you there safely. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Richard, thank you.
Oh, thank you.